I'm happy to introduce Dr. Orit Rozin from the Department of Jewish History at Tel Aviv University. Welcome, Orit.
Hello.
Hello. How did the austerity policy affect the status of women in Israel in the 50s?
Well, first, austerity measures affected women's daily lives. It was very hard to obtain the rations promised by the government. Rations occasionally were cut, and women had to make do with very little. So they stood in lines for many hours every day. And when you're carrying babies with you or toddlers, it is very difficult. And when they came home to cook dinners for their husbands, it was, they had to be very, there was a lot of ingenuity they had to, yeah. Okay, so once women's work became visible to policymakers, it was visible because they needed them so badly to implement the policy. So this is how they gathered some momentum and some access to policymakers' hearts and minds. So for instance, in one cabinet meeting, ministers had to discuss how women mopped the floors because this is probably one of the complaints they heard of. So in 1951, when austerity measures were very harsh and it was very difficult to obtain food and other commodities, including clothes and shoes, women managed to seem like very hard voters to, for the different, from a pie mainly for the chief coalition partner, to gain their votes. So they were seriously worried that they might lose their women's vote to the general Zionists. Mm-hmm. So they passed the Women's Equal Rights Law right before general elections in 1951. And the law affected their lives in the sense that it did promise married women, the ones who were, mostly affected by austerity measures, more control over their property during marriage and after marriage, and child custody rights, and also forbade bigamy on Muslims.
How were children perceived by the Israeli society in the 50s, and what was their role?
Well, Israel aspired to be a modern state, and part of being modern is to take care of the weakest links in society, which is children and women. So we spoke about women, let's talk about children. Children not only gained extensive attention, if we think about laws passed, for instance, compulsory education and protection of working youth and other laws, they also seemed to be an emblem of truth. So for instance, if you wanted to, to deliver a message, I'll give one example. In 1956, a reporter for the Var Daily went to one of the poor neighborhoods, and she interviewed not only the dwellers but also children. And the children portrayed a future that they desired that they didn't have. They didn't have running water, they didn't have electricity and other things. So if you wanted to just talk about the future, you would put it in the mouth of babes.
Regarding the mass immigration of the 50s, we know that the officials of the state strove to turn the immigrant into Israelis through the melting pot policy. But what was the attitude of the new immigrants to those who absorbed them and to the establishment of the state in general? How did they perceive the new Israeli citizenship?
So let's divide your questions into two parts. The first part is, was there really a melting pot policy? And it was partially implemented, or more so implemented in the first year or year and a half of after statehood, but it was very hard to implement afterwards. And some people implemented more than others. For instance, you could see women working with immigrants that were very much invested in forcing the immigrants to comply by what they saw fit, and others that said, well, the immigrants would just accommodate whenever, and they will change whenever they will. So this is one thing. The second thing is that immigrants actually rejected what the government, or part of what the government had planned for them. And they went on to the streets to strike. They refused to vacate from houses where they entered and wanted to live in. And they were violent. So it was very hard to force them to do things they didn't want to do. So they gained a sense of citizenship by doing all these things. When they marched on the streets demonstrating, they became Israeli citizens. They were agents and not subjects.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.